Hello, and welcome to Sinister, where we tell you 3 dark and interesting stories a week. If you want to know more about the format of the show, you can check out the video trailer on this channel's homepage. If you like the show, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on the show or a suggested topic. Thanks again, and enjoy the show. Holiday travel can be a thorn in many people's sides. The busy airports, the crowded flights, the stress of making sure everyone makes it to their destination on time. It's enough to make some people give up and just stay home. The truth is, though uncomfortable at times, most people end up where they're going unscathed, with nothing but stories of annoyances to tell their family members. Sometimes, though, the flight ends before the plane has a chance to land. On December 24, 1971, LANSA Flight 508 departed Lima, Peru's Jorge Chavez International Airport just before noon on its way to Iquitos, Peru. The plane was a Lockheed L-188 Electra American turboprop airliner. It was a low-wing aircraft with 4 propeller engines mounted to the wings. It had a cockpit crew of 3 and could carry 66 to 80 passengers in a mixed-class arrangement, though this plane was set up in a high-density layout which made it able to carry 98 passengers. The flight had one scheduled stop in Pucallpa, Peru, before continuing on to its final destination. Not long before it arrived in Pucallpa, it entered an area of severe thunderstorms and turbulence while flying at 21,000 feet or 6,400 meters. Due to the pressure to meet the holiday schedule, the crew decided to push through the storm. Juliane Koepcke was born on October 10, 1954 in Lima, Peru, to German parents who worked in the city at the Museum of Natural History. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, was a biologist, and her mother, Maria Koepcke, was an ornithologist, someone who studies birds. She would often bring home injured birds to nurse back to health or raise recently hatched chicks that may have been abandoned. When Juliane was born, her parents already had a multicolored parrot in the house who hated the baby at first due to jealousy, but after enough time he finally accepted that the girl was there to stay. Tragedy struck the family shortly after Juliane's birth when her parents left on a 2-month research trip only to be seriously injured in an accident only 8 days into the trip. Hans Wilhelm suffered a broken collarbone and a broken rib, while Maria suffered a skull fracture. Fortunately, baby Juliane was safe at home with her aunt and grandmother, who were also living in Peru at the time. Juliane began her education far before enrolling in school. Her parents would often bring her to the museum where she would learn about the various animals and plants the South American country had to offer. And of course, she learned about the care of animals who were brought home in need of medical attention. At the age of 5, Juliane and her mother took a trip to Germany, crossing the Atlantic Ocean on a freighter ship. There, the young girl witnessed even more wildlife like whales and flying fish. Then, even more experiences once she finally arrived in Germany for her first time. She marveled at the sight of snow, having never experienced anything like it in tropical Peru. Back in Lima, Juliane attended a German-Peruvian school called Alexander von Humboldt. When Juliane was 14 years old, the family moved to an area called Panguana near Iquitos to help establish a research station. Juliane wasn't thrilled about the idea of leaving her friends behind and living in the jungle in the middle of nowhere, but she wasn't scared. She had spent more than enough time in the jungle on her parents' various excursions, but it still didn't seem like a fun place to be. In December of 1967, the family set out on the multi-day journey by truck, riverboat, and then straight up hiking to Panguana. They ended up setting up in a couple of old abandoned huts. They were just raised floors covered with a roof, but they eventually built walls and upgraded cooking equipment. They never had electricity, and a generator would have scared animals away, but they had battery-powered radios to be able to listen to the news or to music. They had a ready supply of bananas, avocados, pineapples, mangoes, guavas, and citrus fruits in the area. Juliane said she ended up quickly loving the area and all of the natural adventures it offered. Not only was Juliane having adventures, but she was learning how to navigate the jungle and utilize its resources. As much as Juliane was learning from her environment, she was still required to do schoolwork, so a friend would mail her lessons which she would complete in their camp. She said she hadn't been good at math, but in the jungle she improved her math skills by having her father start over from the very basics, and that time it seemed to click. Still, the educational authorities wouldn't let Juliane take her final exams in the jungle. They required her to return to Lima to spend the rest of her time in high school on campus. Juliane returned to Lima in March of 1970, and she stayed with friends while there. By then, there were flights between Lima and Pucallpa, so the journey was not so arduous. She flew on her own to Pucallpa to spend her holiday break with her parents. She would have flown back on her own the following year after graduating, but her mother, Maria, was already in town for other commitments, so they chose to fly back together. Maria wanted to return to Penguana on the 19th or 20th of December because Juliane was no longer in classes, but her graduation ball was on the 22nd and the graduation ceremony wasn't until the 23rd. That might seem strange to some, but being in the southern hemisphere, that was the beginning of summer. They pushed back their plans and purchased tickets on the only flight that had available seats. Hans Wilhelm urged his wife not to book a flight on LANSA Airlines due to their poor reputation. Lineas Aéreas Nationalis SA was established in 1963 and had its first accident on April 27, 1966, with 49 fatalities. On August 9, 1970, LANSA Flight 502 lost power to one of its engines and crashed, causing 101 fatalities. Maria was anxious to get back to her husband for Christmas and booked the flight anyway. On December 22, 1971, Juliane attended her high school prom. The following day she attended her graduation ceremony and received her diploma. On the morning of December 24, 1971, Maria and Juliane got up early and headed to the airport. It was Christmas Eve, so of course the place was packed. Many flights had been canceled, and people were clamoring to get another flight. One of them was filmmaker Werner Herzog, who was trying to get to the jungle to shoot scenes for the movie Aguirre Wrath of God. He was supposed to be on the same flight as Juliane and Maria, but he got bumped at the last minute. Though angry at the time, that delay saved his life, and he would go on to make a documentary about Juliane years later. Juliane and her mother were not bumped from the flight and boarded the plane, excited to finally get back to their home in the jungle. What they didn't know at the time was that they were on LANSA's last functioning plane since the rest of their fleet had all previously crashed. About 30 minutes after takeoff, the crew encountered a huge storm, and even though the flight crew suggested returning to Lima, the captain didn't want to disappoint family members during the holidays, so he stayed on course. The turbulence pounded the plane and caused luggage and Christmas presents to bounce around the cabin. Lightning struck the plane and caused a fire. Juliane recalled holding her mother's hand, and as they saw the bright light of a fire on the wing, Maria said, quote, "That is the end. It is all over." Juliane felt the plane turn down into a nosedive. The fire caused one of the wings to rip off the plane and disintegrate. Juliane said that one minute she could hear the people screaming and the sound of the engines, but the next minute all she could hear was the wind in her ears. She had been sucked out of the plane still strapped to her seat, falling through the sky. She was, in fact, still strapped to the entire row of seats she had been in. Juliane had been sitting in the window seat with her mother in the middle seat and another man in the aisle seat. Maria and the man had been thrown from their seats, and Juliana was falling all alone from about 10,000 feet or 3,000 meters. She said she remembered instantly being outside of the plane, falling. She lost consciousness at some point, and when she woke up, she was still falling, but she was hanging upside down and the forest was getting closer. She later described the forest floor beneath her like green cauliflower, like broccoli. She landed on the floor of the Amazon jungle and was knocked unconscious. It's believed that her being strapped to a row of seats acted as a sail to slow her descent enough so she survived the fall. Updrafts in the storm are also theorized to have slowed her descent. Branches in the canopy slowed her even more and are believed to have turned her right side up just before impact with the earth. The muddy ground being soft could have absorbed some of the force of the impact. The plane continued its nosedive into a fiery crash in the Peruvian jungle. Juliana must have awoken at some point and unbuckled herself from the seat and crawled underneath it. She doesn't remember doing it, but theorizes it was in response to the rain. She finally regained full consciousness the next morning with a concussion, a broken collarbone, a cut on her left leg, a cut on her right arm, and the capillaries in her eyes had ruptured due to the rapid decompression of the plane's cabin. To make matters worse, one of her eyes was swollen shut and her glasses were nowhere to be found. She was also missing one of her shoes. Her first concern was to find her mother. Once she was able to process where she was, she instantly realized she was completely alone. Her mother and the man were not with her. None of the passengers were in the area. Juliana called out for her mother, but she remained in silence. She didn't know it at the time, but the largest search operation in Peruvian history had already begun. The flight was only an hour from Lima to Pucallpa, so even the slightest delay would have been noticeable. The air traffic controllers knew immediately that the plane had gone down, though, due to radio transmissions cutting out and then the plane disappearing from radar. Officials hoped that the plane was able to make an emergency landing, but they had no idea what really happened. They began searching for the plane and survivors, but, and this may come as a surprise to you, the Peruvian Amazon is quite large. Even a search within the flight path of the plane would be a massive undertaking, and the chances of finding a single person somewhere in that jungle was very small. A search from the air would be impossible due to the thick tree canopy covering the ground below. Juliana could not stay in place and wait for rescuers to come find her. If she was going to make it out of the jungle, she was going to have to find a way out on her own. When Juliana looked around the immediate area, she found no sign of the plane outside of the row of seats she had been strapped to. Eventually, she stumbled across a bag of sweets and a Christmas stollen. That was a traditional holiday treat that was a loaf of bread with fruit and raisins inside, not unlike a fruitcake. She ate a piece of the bread, but it tasted awful. It had turned to mush in the rain and was mixed with mud, so she left it there. She did take the bag of candy. She was immediately able to use the survival knowledge that she had learned living in the research station by licking fresh rainwater off of leaves in order to quench her thirst. She spent hours in the area where she landed, gaining strength and looking for survivors. She searched for her mother, but was unsuccessful. Suddenly, Juliana could hear the engines of airplanes flying overhead, and she said she knew exactly what they were searching for, but the trees were too dense for anyone to be able to see her. When the plane left and the sounds of the jungle were clear again, Juliana realized that she could hear the faint trickling of water. She followed the sound and found a small spring which she knew she could follow and eventually arrive somewhere populated. Her father had taught her that if she was lost in the jungle, following water downstream would most likely take her to civilization, which is true as a majority of the world's population lives within close proximity to a water source. Juliana had only one shoe and she kept it on despite it making her walk lopsided. She would later explain that she did that to at least have a little more protection for one foot. She didn't have her glasses, so it would be more likely she might step on something dangerous. She described being in just a short mini dress, which made it hard to stay warm during the nights. The days were hot and humid, and she had to be careful not to step on snakes. She walked in knee-high water in the middle of the stream because she knew it was safer. When she wasn't able to walk in the water, she would throw her remaining shoe on the ground in front of her as a test for snakes that might be hiding under leaves. She knew how to make a fire, but it had been so rainy that everything was soaked, so she slept on the bank of the river she was following in the pitch black of night. On her third day in the jungle, she came across one of the plane's engines. One side of the engine was black, and she assumed it had been where the lightning had struck the plane. On the fourth day in the jungle, she came around a turn in the creek and saw a row of airplane seats with 3 passengers still buckled to them, rammed headfirst into the muddy ground. She said that the impact must have been so great that they were buried about 2 feet or 60 centimeters into the muddy earth. The 3 people were dead, and one looked like a woman, so Juliane was horrified to think that she might be her mother. The teenage girl used a stick to remove one of the woman's shoes where she saw she had painted toenails. Maria never painted her toenails. Then Juliane realized that it wouldn't have been her mother since Maria had been in the row of seats with her. She described being relieved that none of them were her mother and then instantly feeling ashamed for feeling that way. Juliane described the sound of vultures in the area. She knew that they were attracted to the carrion in the dead bodies that were now scattered in the area. Carrion is decaying flesh on animals and humans. Many carnivorous animals use carrion as an important part of their diet. Like the vulture, other scavenger animals such as coyotes, hyenas, Komodo dragons, Tasmanian devils, hawks, condors, and eagles are all attracted to carrion. There are also insects like maggots who live off of carrion. By Juliane's 10th day in the jungle, she had finished the bag of candy she had found and was afraid she would starve. She knew that most of what was in the jungle was poisonous, and she wasn't willing to chance eating anything that could kill her. She was able to drink the water from the stream because she knew that it was rare for the water in unpopulated areas to have dysentery. She was having trouble walking, and her wounds were not doing well. Flies had laid eggs in the cut on her arm, which had hatched into maggots and were eating a hole in her flesh. She used a ring she bent into makeshift tweezers to try and pull the maggots out, but they would quickly burrow further into her flesh when she tried. She gave up and continued swimming down the river, but that area being out from under the cover of trees meant she would end up with second-degree burns on her back from the sun. On that 10th day, though, she was so weak she eventually came to a gravel bank and immediately fell asleep on it. When she opened her eyes, she realized there was a large boat on the riverbank and it looked relatively new. It was clearly not an old boat that could have been abandoned. It was a nice new boat that meant there was someone in the area. Juliane said it gave her a boost of adrenaline, and when she found a path of trampled grass nearby, she followed it. She was so weak it took her hours to cover 20 to 30 feet or 6 to 9 meters. She followed the path that led into the jungle and found a small shack with a palm leaf roof. Inside was an outboard motor for the boat and a container of gasoline. She was sure that the owner of the boat must have trekked into the jungle and would be back any minute. Juliane said in an interview that her family dog once had a wound that had become infested with maggots, and her father poured kerosene over it, which caused the larvae to go to the surface of the skin. Then her father removed the maggots and bandaged the wound. She used the gasoline in the same manner and said initially the maggots tried to burrow further into her skin, but they eventually came to the surface where she pulled about 30 maggots out of the wound in her arm. It was extremely painful, but she said in an interview that she felt proud of herself for being able to do it. She would later find out that there were even more, but the ones she got offered enough relief at the time. As darkness fell and nobody had returned to the shack, she decided to sleep there. Initially, she thought the floor of the structure was too hard, so she grabbed a tarp from the shed and went back to the river where she laid in the softer sand. The next morning, there still wasn't anyone around, and she started considering taking the boat, but she didn't want to leave someone else stranded in the jungle like she had been. She said she couldn't bring herself to save her own life by risking someone else's life. She spent the day sitting in the shack wrapped in the tarp, and she eventually made the decision to continue down the river, but she said her body wouldn't move. She was just too weak. Instead, she decided to try and recover some strength with another night's sleep and that she would move on in the morning. She wouldn't have time to fall asleep, though, as that evening, 3 men emerged from the jungle and were shocked to see the pale-skinned, blonde-haired girl in their shack. They later told her they believed she was a water goddess called Yakumama. She was a local legend of a part dolphin, part blonde, pale woman who lived in the area. They explained that that part of the jungle was completely uninhabited, so it was quite unusual to see someone else, let alone a young blonde girl in a shredded mini-dress. She explained in Spanish what had happened, and the men immediately tended to her wounds and gave her food. Despite the food being a soft porridge, she had a hard time keeping any of it down. As one man worked to remove even more maggots from her wound, she asked if anyone else had been rescued. That was when she learned that not a single person from the flight had been found. Not even the plane itself had been located. They told her she was lucky to have found their shack and that they returned to it. They explained that they didn't usually come to check on the boat very often, and when it started to rain they were originally going to wait it out, but made the last-minute decision to return to the shelter. They had to wait until morning to leave the area, so the men gave her pants and a shirt to put on. Despite them being oversized, they would better protect her from the elements. Even though the men gave her a mosquito net to keep the bugs away, she said she could barely sleep. The next day, they loaded her into the boat, covered by the tarp, and began the 7-hour journey to a village called Torna Vista. In the village, a nurse met them at the boat, and it turned out to be the same nurse that had given Juliane a tetanus shot when she was preparing to move to Penguana. She cleaned and dressed Juliana's wounds and gave her a shot of antibiotics. Then a woman offered to fly her to another village that had more doctors, and though Juliane was not excited about getting on a plane, she realized it was the best option. The doctors there removed even more maggots from her wounds, and when they were finally all gone, the wounds were then packed with gauze soaked in disinfectant. Her other wounds, including a splinter in her foot and inflamed insect bites all over her body, were treated, and Juliane was finally able to fall into a sound sleep. The next day, she was reunited with her father. She worked with authorities to help locate the wreckage of Flight 508. One report says that there were 6 other people who survived the crash, and another said that 12 other people had survived, but none of them survived the jungle. On January 12, 1972, the body of Maria was located in the jungle. It's believed that she was one of the people who survived the crash, but she suffered injuries that prevented her from moving. She died a few days after the crash. Juliane would write in her autobiography that the story of her rescue would take off like wildfire and result in some interesting versions of events. She said the most popular version of the story was that she built her own raft out of sticks and leaves and floated down the river. Eventually, some natives saw her float by unconscious and pulled the raft ashore, where she lifted her head and said, quote, "There are dead people," before passing back out. Though that might make a better movie, likely directed by M. Night Shyamalan, it never actually happened. Flight 508 had 6 crew members and 86 passengers. All of them died but one, Juliane Koepcke. She eventually moved to Germany, where she fully recovered from her injuries and went on to get her PhD in zoology. She returned to Peru to study bats and published her thesis, Ecological Study of a Bat Colony in the Tropical Rainforest of Peru, in 1987. She is now married and known as Juliane Diller. She's the librarian at the Bavarian State Collection of Zoology in Munich, Germany. She returned to the plane wreckage in 1998 when Werner Herzog made the documentary Wings of Hope. In 2019, the government of Peru awarded her the Order of Merit for Distinguished Service and the degree of Grand Officer. If you want to know more about Juliane's life, including the incredible tale of how her father made it to Peru after World War II, I suggest you read her autobiography, When I Fell from the Sky. It's available in physical or digital form wherever you buy books. Thanks so much for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you like the show, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also hit like or leave a comment with your thoughts about the show or a suggestion for an episode. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week where we'll take you somewhere sinister.